Karen refuses plane seat for old veteran, turns pale after he gives her an astonishing note. Sandra hurried through the bustling airport, her bright pink suitcase trailing behind her as she clutched her daughter Lily's hand. The 7-year-old bounced with excitement, her eyes wide with wonder at the sea of uniforms and luggage surrounding them. They had cut it close, barely making it to their flight on time. As they reached their assigned seats, 14B and 14C, Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. She quickly stowed their carry-on and settled Lily into the aisle seat before taking her place in the middle. The stress of navigating the airport melted away, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. However, their moment of calm was short-lived. As the last passengers filed onto the plane, an elderly man approached their row. His face was deeply lined, a testament to years of experience, but his back remained ramrod straight, hinting at a military past. In his hands, he clutched a worn-out military cap, his fingers tracing its edges with a familiarity born of years. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a gravely whisper that spoke of stories untold. "I believe I'm in 14A, but would it be possible for me to take the aisle seat instead? You two could have the window and middle seats." Sandra glanced at the man, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way he struggled to maintain his balance as the plane swayed. A pang of sympathy shot through her, but she steeled herself against it. They had specifically chosen these seats for a reason. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice polite but firm. "We specifically reserved the aisle seat." The man nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his weathered features. Yet he paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I understand, ma'am. It's just that I have a bad knee, an old war injury. If I could stretch it out in the aisle rather than being cramped up, it would really help ease the pain." His eyes briefly darted to the tiny space he'd have to squeeze into, a flash of discomfort crossing his face. Lily, ever curious, peered up at him. "Did you fight in a war?" Her voice was filled with a mix of awe and concern that only a child could muster. The old veteran's face softened as he looked down at her. "I did many years ago," he replied with a gentle smile. As they spoke, another passenger, a middle-aged woman with an air of impatience, interrupted. "Can we move this along?" Her tone was sharper than necessary, slicing through the tentative connection forming in their row. Sandra felt the weight of other passengers' stares, their silent judgments pressing down on her. She swallowed hard, her initial resolve wavering. Yet when she spoke, her voice still held a note of apology tinged with stubbornness. "I'm really sorry, but my daughter gets motion sick easily. The aisle seat helps her." The veteran nodded, a subtle stiffness entering his demeanor as he began to maneuver into the row. His knee popped audibly as he moved, eliciting a wince that he tried to mask with a strained smile. As he settled in, Sandra couldn't help but overhear a hushed conversation between two young men seated across the aisle. "Tough break for the old guy," one whispered, not quite low enough. "Korean War vets deserve better." The words stung Sandra, a mix of guilt and defensiveness rising within her. She turned her attention back to Lily, who was now watching the veteran with wide, worried eyes. Just then, a flight attendant approached, her expression one of trained neutrality. "Ma'am, we have a premium seat available up front. It's usually reserved, but it's open for this flight. It might make the situation easier." Her gaze flicked to the veteran. "Sir, would you consider taking it?" Sandra hesitated, caught off guard. The offer was a solution, but it also felt like a public reprimand. She hoped the veteran would accept, easing the tension that had settled over their row. But to her surprise, he gently declined. "Thank you, but I wouldn't want to cause any more fuss," he said softly. "I'm fine here." The moment hung heavy and uncomfortable as the flight attendant moved on and the final preparations for takeoff began. Sandra felt the weight of the other passengers' stares, their silent judgments mingling with the hum of the engines. In a low voice meant only for Sandra, the veteran leaned slightly toward her. "I appreciate your situation," he said, his tone earnest. "I have a granddaughter about her age. It's important she's comfortable." Sandra met his gaze, the tension easing slightly. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling both grateful and ashamed. The simple grace of his understanding offered her a sliver of redemption, albeit one she wasn't sure she deserved. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, the whispered judgments around Sandra didn't subside. Instead, they grew into a dissonant chorus of discontent among the passengers. The cabin felt smaller with each passing minute, claustrophobic, as if every sideways glance and furrowed brow was directed at her. Lily, sensitive to the shift in mood, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why do people look mad at us?" Her voice, filled with innocent concern, amplified Sandra's discomfort. Before Sandra could formulate a reassuring response, a new twist arose. The in-flight entertainment system flickered to life, and the opening scene of a documentary about veterans of foreign wars played on the screen. It was as if fate itself was chastising her for her earlier decision. Mr. Kim, as Sandra had learned the veteran's name was, glanced at the screen, then at Lily. In an unexpected move, he reached into his bag, pulling out a small, faded photograph of a young soldier, himself in uniform. He handed it to Lily. "That was me, a long time ago," he explained, his voice tinged with a mix of nostalgia and sorrow. Lily's interest piqued, and she studied the photo with wide eyes before showing it to Sandra, who forced a smile, her guilt deepening as the film narrated battles and sacrifices. A teenage boy sitting behind them leaned forward. "My grandpa was in the Korean War too," he said, his voice loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "He told me stories about the brave men he served with." His eyes, bright and earnest, flicked to Mr. Kim with respect. Sandra felt her face flush as more passengers joined the conversation, sharing their connections to military service. Each story added layers to the palpable sense of reverence for the sacrifices made by veterans. Meanwhile, Sandra's earlier refusal seemed increasingly petty in this new context. Then the situation escalated further. The flight attendant who had offered the premium seat earlier returned with a complimentary drink for Mr. Kim. "On the house, for your service," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Her look toward Sandra was pointed and reproachful. As Mr. Kim thanked her, he accidentally knocked his glass, spilling water on himself. Instantly, Sandra's protective instincts kicked in, not for herself but for the elderly veteran beside her. She handed him napkins, her actions swift. "I'm so sorry. Let me help," she said, her tone genuine. This act, simple yet caring, caused a slight shift in the cabin's atmosphere. A few passengers glanced over, their expressions softening. It was a small redemption, but Sandra felt it deeply. As she helped him, Mr. Kim whispered another surprise. "I've been on many flights," he confided, "but this one is special. I'm going to meet someone I saved during the war. Haven't seen him since 1953. His eyes gleamed with a mix of excitement and anxiety. This revelation struck a chord within Sandra. Here was a man who had not only served his country but had directly saved another's life, continuing to honor those bonds decades later. Her perspective shifted, the weight of her decision at the beginning of the flight settling heavily upon her. The tension in the air lingered, but now it was tinged with anticipation and a new form of respect for Mr. Kim's humility and the unexpected journey he shared. Sandra realized that her initial refusal had set the stage for a deeper understanding, not just of Mr. Kim's past, but of the complexities surrounding every decision made in the moment. As night enveloped the aircraft, passengers settled into a quieter, contemplative mood. The gentle hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop, but for Sandra, each thrum was a reminder of the unresolved tension around her. Mr. Kim, noticing Lily's restlessness from the day's drama in the dimmed cabin lights, reached into his carry-on once more. This time, he produced a small, intricately carved wooden box. "I want to show you something," he said to Lily, his voice barely above a whisper to not disturb the resting passengers. Lily's eyes sparkled with curiosity as he opened the box to reveal a set of old, colorful medals, their ribbons faded by time, yet still vibrant. "These were awarded to me for various missions," he explained, allowing her to gently touch the cool metal. Lily's awe was palpable, and even Sandra found herself drawn into the history held in those small tokens. The gentle interaction was observed by a young woman sitting diagonally across from them. Moved by the scene, she approached Sandra. "I noticed earlier. I might have judged too quickly," she admitted, her apology sincere and punctuated by a rueful smile. "My brother's in the military. I guess I got a bit protective." Sandra nodded, accepting the olive branch. "Thank you. It's been a tough flight for all of us," she responded, feeling the first thread of relief weave through the tension. Further into the flight, Mr. Kim asked for Sandra's assistance to stand, needing to stretch his legs. As they walked slowly down the aisle, his limp more pronounced than before, they paused by a passenger who had been particularly vocal about Sandra's refusal earlier. Seeing Mr. Kim struggle up close, the passenger's face softened. "Can I help?" he offered, standing to support Mr. Kim on the other side. This small act of kindness rippled through the nearby seats, a silent acknowledgement of shared responsibility and understanding. Conversations began to restart, this time with a more harmonious tone, as passengers shared snippets of their lives related to times of struggle and support. As Sandra and Mr. Kim returned to their seats, the pilot announced mild turbulence ahead. The seatbelt sign flicked on, adding a physical reminder of the need for safety and caution. Mr. Kim, securing his belt, leaned over to Sandra. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said, handing her a small folded piece of paper. Curious, Sandra opened it to find a short poem written in a shaky hand. She turned pale, astonished by the note and its contents. It spoke of gratitude in the unexpected journeys that bring people together. "I wrote that years ago," Mr. Kim explained. "It's about how sometimes the most challenging moments teach us the most." Overwhelmed by the gesture, Sandra felt her eyes moisten. The poem, though simple, captured the essence of their shared flight. A journey marked by discomfort but defined by growth and unexpected connections. The cabin lights gradually brightened, heralding the approach of dawn and the imminent end of their overnight flight. Passengers stirred from their intermittent slumber, stretching and murmuring as the reality of landing began to set in. Sandra clutched the folded poem in her pocket, the weight of the paper disproportionate to its size, heavy with meaning and revelations. As she pondered the night's events, Mr. Kim seemed contemplative, his gaze fixed on the slowly lightening horizon visible through the small airplane window. The calm before landing was abruptly disrupted when a flight attendant made an announcement. "We have a situation," the attendant began. "There's a minor medical emergency with a passenger in first class. We need to prepare for a potential quick descent and medical team boarding upon landing. Everyone should now return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts." The unexpected news sent a ripple of concern through the cabin. Sandra glanced at Mr. Kim, wondering if his medical expertise from his military days might be of help. But the plane suddenly went into a steep descent, and all there was time for was to say a quick prayer that nothing would go wrong. The descent had been extreme, and many of the passengers had been fearful for the worst. As the wheels touched down on the runway, an audible sigh of relief rippled through the plane. It was then that Mr. Kim leaned over, his earlier formality replaced by an earnest need to share. "This note," he said, indicating the poem he had given Sandra earlier, "was written on the back of a map during a night much like this, under a sky full of stars, not knowing if dawn would find us. I wrote it for a friend who never made it home. I want you to have it because I think he would have liked you." Sandra, moved beyond words, simply nodded, her understanding complete. The journey, though fraught with tension and misunderstandings, had brought them to this point of mutual respect and shared history. The cabin filled with the typical sounds of landing, and with a soft chime, the seatbelt sign clicked off, snapping them back to reality. As passengers began to gather their belongings, Sandra and Mr. Kim remained seated, caught in one final moment of reflection. For them, the real journey was just beginning. As Mr. Kim prepared to stand, Sandra instinctively reached out to assist him, their earlier friction long forgotten. A nearby passenger noticed the simple act and nodded appreciatively, silently acknowledging their newfound camaraderie. Just then, a man in a crisp uniform approached them, his cap tucked under one arm. "Mr. Kim?" he inquired, his voice carrying a tone of deep respect. "My name is Captain Jones. I heard about your service from the crew. I wanted to personally thank you for your sacrifice." The introduction took both Sandra and Mr. Kim by surprise. The captain's presence underscored the depth of respect the veteran commanded. Sandra watched as Mr. Kim shook hands with the captain, his weathered face breaking into a proud smile as they conversed. Sandra's phone vibrated in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw a message from her mother. It was a photo of her grandfather in his military uniform. the same one she'd shown Mr. Kim earlier. But this time, there was an attachment, a letter her grandfather had written about a soldier who had saved his life during the war. The soldier's name was James Kim. Sandra gasped, her eyes darting up to meet Mr. Kim's. Handing him the phone, she watched his reaction as he read the letter. Mr. Kim's hand shook as he held the phone, tears welling up in his eyes. "That's me," he whispered. "I was James. I never knew if he made it back." The coincidence was staggering. Not only had their paths crossed on this flight by chance, but their familial histories were intertwined by acts of heroism decades earlier. The revelation brought a new level of significance to their encounter, transforming it from a simple act of seat refusal to a meeting of fate. The captain, overhearing their exchange, smiled broadly. "It seems this flight was destined to bring together old bonds," he gestured to the crew, who were now observing the emotional scene. "Let's give these two some space to talk." As the other passengers disembarked, Sandra and Mr. Kim were left in the quiet of the now almost empty aircraft. "Your grandfather's courage gave me a second chance at life," Mr. Kim said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Meeting you today, it feels like I've come full circle." Sandra nodded, her previous reservations melted away, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude and connection. "I'm honored to meet you, Mr. Kim, and I'm sorry for my earlier actions." "No apologies needed," Mr. Kim replied. "Today has brought me more joy than you can imagine. It's reminded me of the good that can come from open hearts and open minds." Together, they walked off the plane, their steps slow but sure. As they exited the terminal, the fresh morning air greeted them, tinged with the promise of new revelations. Sandra had arranged for a taxi to take them home, but Mr. Kim, ever the gentleman, insisted on waiting with them until their ride arrived. While they waited, Mr. Kim pulled out his old battered wallet and began to show Lily more photographs from his time during the Korean War. Among them was a picture of a young man standing beside him, both in uniform, smiling despite the evident harshness of their surroundings. "This was my best friend during the war, Daniel," Mr. Kim explained, his voice laden with nostalgia. "We lost touch after the war. I always wondered what became of him." Fascinated, Lily pointed at the photograph. "He looks kind. Does he live near here too?" Mr. Kim shook his head, a wistful expression crossing his face. "Last I heard, he moved to Canada, but that was decades ago. I tried to find him for years without any luck." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their taxi. As they prepared to say their goodbyes, Sandra felt a strange reluctance to part ways with Mr. Kim, considering the deep connection that had been revealed. On impulse, she invited him to join them for brunch at their home, an offer he accepted with a grateful smile. During the drive, Sandra texted her mother to find out more about her grandfather's military friends, driven by a budding hunch. Her mother quickly replied, confirming that her grandfather had indeed mentioned a friend named Daniel who moved to Canada but had returned to the States later in life. Arriving home, Sandra introduced Mr. Kim to her mother, who had come over to meet the man from Sandra's stories. The introduction sparked an immediate recognition in Mr. Kim's eyes. "You look just like your father," he told Sandra's mother, especially around the eyes. Sandra's mother was taken aback by the familiarity with which he spoke. As they sat down for brunch, Sandra's mother brought out more of her father's old letters and photos. They spread them on the table, and everyone leaned in, absorbed by the artifacts of a bygone era. Suddenly, Mr. Kim paused, his finger trembling as he pointed at a photo of a young soldier with a distinctive scar across his forehead. "That's Daniel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was your father's friend." "Yes, and he mentioned you too, Mr. Kim," Sandra's mother responded, her voice thick with emotion. "He talked about a friend who saved his life by dragging him to safety during a firefight. He called you his guardian angel." The room fell silent, the weight of the past bridging generations. Mr. Kim's eyes filled with tears as he absorbed the news. "Daniel passed away 5 years ago," Sandra's mother continued softly. "He often spoke of hoping to reconnect with you." Moved by the discovery, Mr. Kim reached into his bag and pulled out the small wooden box he had shown Lily on the plane. He opened it again, this time extracting a faded letter alongside the medals. "I wrote this to Daniel after the war, but I never knew where to send it." Sandra read the letter aloud. It was a heartfelt thank you to a friend who had been more like a brother, a promise to meet again in better times. As the letter ended, Sandra's mother retrieved one more item from her collection, a letter from Daniel addressed to Mr. Kim, never sent, echoing the same sentiments of brotherhood and reunion. The brunch extended well into the afternoon, the initial purpose of the meal overshadowed by the extraordinary reunion of stories and memories shared across the table. What had started as a tense flight had unfolded into a beautiful narrative of friendship, sacrifice, and serendipity. As Mr. Kim prepared to leave, he hugged Sandra and her mother. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's as if I found a part of Daniel again through you and your family." Sandra smiled, her heart full. "You've brought us closer to understanding our own history," she replied. They promised to stay in touch, to continue sharing stories, and maybe find other lost connections. In the days that followed, Sandra found herself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. What had begun as Karen's refusal of a seat, an act born of inconvenience and self-interest, had blossomed into a profound lesson in empathy, respect, and the shared tapestry of human experience. She thought about how close they had come to missing this connection. If she had remained stubborn, if Mr. Kim had been less understanding, if any small detail had been different, they might never have uncovered the remarkable story that linked their families across generations. Sandra reached out to local veterans groups, inspired to learn more about the experiences of those who had served. She organized a small gathering at her home, inviting Mr. Kim to share his stories with others who might benefit from hearing them. The event was a success, drawing together people from all walks of life, each finding common ground in the shared human experiences of struggle, sacrifice, and resilience. Lily, too, had been deeply affected by the experience. She began a school project on veterans, interviewing Mr. Kim and other local veterans, creating a beautiful tapestry of stories that brought history to life for her classmates. Her teacher was so impressed that she invited Mr. Kim to speak to the entire school, fostering a new generation's appreciation for the sacrifices of those who came before them. As for Karen, that initial moment of inconvenience that had nearly derailed everything, Sandra realized it had been a pivotal moment of growth. She found herself more aware of the small choices she made each day, how a moment of consideration or a simple act of kindness could ripple outward in ways she might never fully comprehend. One afternoon, weeks after their fateful flight, Sandra received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photograph of Mr. Kim and Daniel, young and smiling in their uniforms, along with a note, "Dear Sandra and Lily, I can't express how much our chance meeting has meant to me. You've given me back a piece of my past I thought was lost forever. But more than that, you've reminded me that every interaction, no matter how small, has the potential to change lives. I've enclosed this photo of Daniel and me. I hope it will serve as a reminder of the unexpected ways our lives can intertwine and the enduring power of human connection. Thank you for turning what could have been just another flight into a journey of rediscovery and healing. With deepest gratitude, James Kim." Sandra hung the photo in their living room, a constant reminder of the extraordinary story that had unfolded from a simple plane ride. She often found herself pausing before it, marveling at the twists of fate that had brought them all together. As time passed, the story of their encounter spread, touching hearts and inspiring others to look beyond first impressions and inconveniences. It became a testament to the power of compassion, the importance of listening to others' stories, and the profound impact that small acts of kindness can have. In the end, what began as Karen's refusal of a seat became a catalyst for change, not just for Sandra and her family, but for an entire community. It served as a powerful reminder that behind every stranger is a story waiting to be told, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections arise from the most unexpected circumstances. Their story became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to approach life with more empathy, to listen more deeply, and to recognize the potential for extraordinary discoveries in everyday encounters. It was a lesson in the richness of human experience and the countless ways our lives are interconnected, often in ways we can't begin to imagine until we open our hearts and minds to the possibilities that surround us. And so, a simple plane ride became much more than a journey from one place to another. It became a journey of the heart, a bridge across generations, and a testament to the enduring power of human connection. In the tapestry of life, it was a vivid thread, weaving together past and present, strangers and friends, in a pattern of understanding and grace that would continue to unfold for years to come. Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.